This video is to explain a possible way to make a do-it-yourself emergency ventilator at home using only components that you might find in a common household. Uh, as a warning, there's no evidence to show that this contraption can actually help. It's purely an experiment, and its intention is to help promote ideas onto how to make a ventilator if you had no other option and you're stuck at home. A little bit on the history of this project. So, as an engineer staying in breath on the coronavirus pandemic, it's really impressive to see the outreach of different industries trying to help out and rapidly engineer different ventilator alternatives. A couple notable projects: MIT has a really cool system to develop a low-cost ventilator to help many medical facilities, same with Virgin Orbit. The list goes on. However, one thing I noticed in all these projects as I researched them was that they all rely on a bag valve mechanism, which is a key technology component to any makeshift ventilator. It essentially lets you insert the right pressure into the patient's mouth, the right volume, and it originally were used by hand. But a lot of where custom manufacturing and innovation comes in is how do you replace the hand with the right mechanism to make the bag valve function properly. So this got me thinking, is there any way I can make a ventilator at home? And why would you ever use a do-it-yourself ventilator at home? A couple situations I thought of were emergency situations where for some reason you can't call for help. Maybe the phone lines are down, maybe you don't have a phone, you can't leave the house for whatever reason, you're in some rural location, you don't have a car, the roads are blocked, or in some freak scenario where even if you are at a medical facility, there's no more bag valve presence, which I certainly hope is never the case, and I certainly hope that no one ever actually has to build this contraption I'm describing. I hope that there's enough well-designed ventilators in use to be able to avoid having to make one using home components. So the core goals I had when entering this project were to have the same core functionality that a regular ventilator has, as well as the makeshift ventilators we're seeing, which are three core components. One, be able to control the deliverable pressure going into the patient's lung. Two, be able to adjust the volume of air going into each assisted breath. And three, being able to adjust the frequency at which those breaths are delivered. The second core goal I wanted to achieve in this project, and this is key, is to be able to build a mechanism that achieves these functionalities only using components that you might find in the common household, as well as making it buildable by someone that has no knowledge of electronics or manufacturing techniques whatsoever. One of the inspirations for this project, for me personally, was actually a scene in Apollo 13. It was a scene where the astronauts were having trouble breathing, I guess akin to today's pandemic problems, because their CO2 concentrations were rising too much, and they couldn't replace their CO2 filters, so they had to find a way to jerry-rig the CO2 filter cartridge that they had in one module, bring them to the other, and all they could use was components they had in the spacecraft. So the engineers threw all the components they had in the spacecraft onto a table on Earth, and they found a way to jerry-rig the system. So very similar to the Apollo 13 scene, where you can only build things that you have available on your spacecraft. I wanted to see if there's a way to build a ventilator mechanism using only components you could find at home. The list I developed was duct tape, paper towel roll, string, scissors, a plastic funnel. If you don't have one, you can make one out of a paper plate or paper, some sort of water container, some sort of hosing, and in these two important items, a standard vacuum cleaner, either handheld or upright, and an oscillating fan. So with that in mind, let's take a deeper dive into the schematic as to how all these components work together to make a ventilator. Okay, so let's look at this diagram in a bit more detail. At the beginning of the system, we have a standard vacuum. It's just been converted to a blower by blocking off and taping off all the air exits. So all the air gets sucked in, and then we leave one of them open, and we just attach a manifold to it that we can then work off of. In this case, it's a cardboard paper towel tube. From there, the air gets diverted down this hose or pipe, and then it gets delivered into the patient's lung. It can get delivered a couple different ways. One is just to have a tube shoved down the patient's throat, or alternatively, build this oil funnel mechanism with a sock and some tape wrapped around it that you then put over the patient's mouth and nose. I can go over that in a separate video. One thing to note is that the diameter of this hose or pipe should be large as possible. I found that for my standard vacuum, something around 1.5 inches, 2-inch diameter would be okay. Also note that before the flow gets to the patient's lung, we tap into the manifold and we take a pipe, should also be similar size and diameter, that goes into a wine bottle full of water. Now this wine bottle, or it could be in a container, a milk jug, whatever, it serves two important purposes. One, you can accurately dial in what pressure you want to deliver the air into the patient's lung. And you can do that by adjusting the tip of the bottom of the tube at different distances to the top of the water level. And that lets you adjust the pressure that the air system sees inside the piping. Two, it acts as a safety relief valve. So in the case of the vacuum or the blower is blowing too much flow or pressure into the patient's lung, rather than damaging the lung or making it explode, it's going to divert all excess pressure and flow safely as exhaust bubbles into the air. Great, so now once the flow goes into the patient's lung, the patient's going to want to naturally exhale at some point, and they can do so by exhaling the carbon dioxide into this exhaust vent, come up here. However, they can only do so when this valve is open. Because when this valve is open, the path of least resistance during an exhale is to go, rather than back upstream, fighting the flow of the blower, safely out this large diameter exhaust vent. But of course, once this valve closes again, then the flow from the vacuum has nowhere else to go again but to the path of least resistance, which is the patient's lung, so it will fill the lung back up with fresh air. This cycle will repeat indefinitely because this on-off valve is driven by an oscillating fan. It takes a little bit of tinkering, maybe adding some weights to the funnel. Of course, the inside of the funnel is plugged, and to get that to work right. Some oscillating fans have functions to change the oscillating rate. If that's not the case, I'm currently working on trying to find ways to change the frequency of oscillation from a fixed oscillating fan rate using a complex pulley mechanism, so stay tuned for that. You can also use any other oscillating device. For example, some cake mixers have an oscillating arm you can leverage. Those are actually quite high torque. It could be anything. So this area is still open for exploration. In terms of adjusting the amount of, so now from the three core functionalities of a ventilator, pressure regulation, which is accomplished by this wine bottle or water container mechanism, tidal volume, frequency regulation, which for now I only have one fixed frequency, but ideally there should be a way to adjust it. And then the third one is controlling the volume of air that goes into each breath. To do that, you have to have enough flow from your blower or vacuum to be able to play around with it. And then you also have to be able to put a balloon on top of this and then use some creative measuring to measure how much volume comes into the balloon before and after each breath. So you can kind of measure how much each delivered breath is. If it's too big, you need to constrict the flow going into the lungs here. And it's important to do it. You can do it here with a binder clip or a potato chip bag clip or a weight. You can get creative to do anything. You just have to constrict the flow, but make sure to do it before where the tap is going into the pressure monitoring and safety relief valve mechanism. That way, by tapping into the pressure after the constriction, you get a more accurate representation of what the actual pressure is inside the patient's lung. Similarly, if it's taking too long to exhale, or if you're exhaling too quickly, you can make a constriction here to slow down that exhale rate. If you're exhaling too slowly, you probably want to increase the diameter of this piping, make it easier to vent off, maybe play around with this valve. But in a nutshell, that's the basics piping schematic of this system. Yeah.
The doctor could monitor when he may stop treatment. Upper respiratory tract infection. Tell your doctor.
handed us this one, and we gotta come through. We gotta find a way to make this fit into the hole for this, using nothing but that. Let's get it organized.
Okay, let's build a filter.
Better get some coffee.
What's this?
That's what they gotta make.
Well, I hope you got the procedures for me.
Right here.
That's it?